June 11th, 1944. The sun beat mercilessly over the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea as Lieutenant Commander James "Daredevil" Thatch gripped the controls of his F-6F Hellcat fighter. His knuckles whitened as he watched the approaching swarm of Japanese Zeros, hundreds of them, their distinctive silhouettes stark against the cloudless blue. Radio chatter filled his ears, orders from the carrier USS Lexington coming through with crystal clarity. Hold position, wait for reinforcements, do not engage. The carrier admiral feared their squadron of just 24 Hellcats would be overwhelmed by the superior numbers. But Thatch had noticed something during previous engagements that the top brass hadn't. Something about how his Hellcat responded in steep dives that might just turn the tide. The Zero pilots were counting on American pilots following standard engagement protocols. They were wrong. Sometimes, Thatch whispered to himself as he cut his radio transmission, how you have to break the rules to make history. He pitched his nose downward, at an angle fleet engineers had explicitly warned against, feeling the airframe shudder violently as his aircraft accelerated beyond recommended combat speeds. The altimeter spun wildly as the ocean rushed up to meet him, and in that moment, James Thatch knew disobeying direct orders could end his naval career forever, or save hundreds of American sailors from the approaching Japanese onslaught that threatened to overwhelm their fleet. James William Thatch came from humble beginnings in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, born on February 7, 1905, to a family of farmers who valued hard work and ingenuity above all else. Growing up during the Great War, young James would spend hours whittling wooden airplanes, inspired by newspaper accounts of aerial combat over the fields of France. His father, William, often found him staring skyward when he should have been tending to chores. "Boy's got his head in the clouds," he'd say with a mixture of frustration and pride. Unlike many of his peers who saw military service as an obligation, James viewed it as his calling. In 1927, after graduating from the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, he chose naval aviation, despite its reputation as the most dangerous assignment in the peacetime military. During training, Thatch's instructors noted his unconventional thinking. "Thatch questions everything," wrote one flight instructor. "Makes him either the best or most dangerous pilot I've ever trained." This questioning nature didn't always endear him to his superiors. During carrier qualification exercises aboard the USS Langley in 1929, he argued with his squadron commander about approach vectors, insisting there was a more efficient way to land on the pitching deck. His suggestions earned him the nickname Daredevil, half admiration, half warning. By 1939, as war clouds gathered over Europe and Asia, Lieutenant Commander Thatch found himself assigned to Fighter Squadron 3, VF-3, flying early model F-4F Wildcats. It was during these pre-war years that he began documenting the weaknesses in American fighter tactics. "Our current dogfighting approach assumes equal maneuverability," he wrote in a report that was largely ignored. Against the Japanese Zero, this assumption could prove fatal. When news of the Zero's capabilities reached American intelligence through combat reports from Flying Tigers pilots in China, Thatch's concerns deepened. He spent countless hours studying the fragmented reports, often working late into the night in his quarters aboard carriers during Pacific exercises. Using matchsticks on his desk to represent aircraft, he developed what would later become known as the Thatch Weave, a defensive tactic that helped Wildcat pilots survive against the more nimble Zero. But he knew defensive tactics alone wouldn't win the air war. By early 1943, now commanding a squadron of the newer F-6F Hellcats, Thatch continued pushing boundaries. During training exercises off Hawaii, he deliberately exceeded the aircraft's operational guidelines, testing its structural limits and performance envelope. His squadron mates noticed his increasingly aggressive testing. "The commander's going to tear the wings off one of these days," Lieutenant Harvey Ross remarked after watching Thatch pull out of a particularly steep dive. What his peers didn't realize was that Thatch was systematically gathering data, filling notebooks with calculations, observations, and possibilities that contradicted the official performance manuals. When a visiting engineer from Grumman, the Hellcats manufacturer, discovered what Thatch was doing, he was horrified. "These aircraft have specific operational parameters for a reason, Commander," the man warned. "Exceeding them doesn't just risk your life, it could lead to catastrophic failures that would ground the entire fleet." Thatch merely nodded, but continued his experiments in secret. By the time the massive carrier battles of 1944 loomed, James Thatch had accumulated substantial evidence that the Hellcat could do something the Japanese never anticipated. Something that could change the course of the Pacific War if employed at precisely the right moment. But convincing the rigid command structure of the U.S. Navy to abandon established doctrine would prove nearly impossible, until fate intervened in the skies over the Philippine Sea. The summer of 1944 marked a critical turning point in the Pacific theater of World War II. Following the island-hopping strategy championed by Admiral Chester Nimitz, American forces had pushed steadily westward, reclaiming territories previously lost to Japanese expansion. The Imperial Japanese Navy, still reeling from devastating losses at Midway 2 years earlier, understood that the momentum of the war was shifting against them. In a desperate bid to regain the initiative, the Japanese High Command formulated Operation Ago, a complex naval counteroffensive centered around the Mariana Islands. American intelligence had detected unusual Japanese fleet movements by late May, suggesting a major confrontation was imminent. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, commanded by the methodical and cautious Admiral Raymond Spruance, included 15 aircraft carriers with over 900 aircraft, a staggering concentration of naval air power. Among these were 36 squadrons of F-6F Hellcats, the newest American fighter aircraft specifically designed to counter the once dominant Japanese A-6M Zero. The Zero had achieved near-mythical status early in the war. Lightweight, agile, and possessing exceptional range, it had outclassed every Allied fighter during the war's opening phases. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros brought back harrowing tales of its maneuverability. "They could turn inside our tightest circle," recalled one P-40 pilot who escaped a Zero attack over New Guinea. "It was like trying to outmaneuver a hummingbird with a freight train." The Zero's reputation created a psychological barrier among Allied pilots, many of whom believed engaging Zeros in traditional dogfighting was suicidal. But by 1944, the technological advantage had shifted. The F-6F Hellcat represented American industrial might, and engineering ingenuity focused on a single purpose: defeating the Zero. With its powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine generating 2,000 horsepower, the Hellcat outperformed the Zero in almost every category except turn radius. It could climb faster, dive quicker, and, crucially, absorb tremendous punishment while keeping its pilots safe. The Japanese A-6M Zero, with its lightweight construction and minimal armor, sacrificed pilot protection for maneuverability. American intelligence estimated that the Japanese had committed nearly 500 carrier-based aircraft to the coming battle, including approximately 300 Zeros. What made the situation particularly dangerous was the Japanese carriers' ability to launch land-based aircraft from the Marianas, effectively doubling their striking power. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier force, believed that superior Japanese pilot training and fighting spirit would overcome the Americans' numerical advantage. What neither side fully appreciated was how the performance characteristics of their respective aircraft would interact under the extreme conditions of what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Standard U.S. Navy fighter doctrine in 1944 emphasized coordinated attacks, mutual support, and disciplined formation flying. Pilots were explicitly instructed to avoid extreme maneuvers that might stress their aircraft beyond design limits. The official F-6F-3 Hellcat pilot's manual contained specific warnings about steep diving angles. Prolonged dives exceeding 350 knots indicated airspeed may result in dangerous compressibility effects, control surface flutter, and potential structural failure. These guidelines, conservative by necessity, were designed to minimize aircraft losses during an era when manufacturing capacity was as important as tactical success. But as James Thatch and a handful of other experienced pilots had discovered during combat testing, the Hellcat possessed capabilities beyond those officially recognized, capabilities that could prove decisive if the right opportunity presented itself. The stage was set for what naval historians would later call the largest carrier battle in history. And in the middle of this massive confrontation, James Thatch's unauthorized discovery would upend the conventional wisdom about air combat in ways that would reshape naval aviation doctrine forever. The morning of June 19th dawned with an eerie calm that veterans recognized as the stillness before chaos. Task Force 58, the main American carrier strike force, had been sailing in a defensive formation since the previous evening, when long-range patrols had reported sighting elements of the Japanese fleet. Admiral Mach, commanding the American carriers, had ordered dawn patrols to launch at first light. Lieutenant Commander Thatch had slept fitfully, his mind working through calculations and contingencies. He knew something major was coming. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese were committing everything they had to this engagement. In the ready room aboard USS Lexington, pilots gathered for their pre-mission briefing. The squadron intelligence officer pointed to marked positions on the large plotting map. Reports indicate a large Japanese carrier group here, approximately 200 miles west of our position, he explained, his pointer circling an area of the Philippine Sea. Admiral Mach wants continuous combat air patrol over our task force and scout planes maintaining contact with the enemy fleet. Commander Samuel Sunshine Phillips, the air group commander, stepped forward. Listen up, people. Standard doctrine applies. If we locate the Japanese carriers, we attack per plan Baker 6. Fighters will suppress enemy cap while bombers strike the carriers. Under no circumstances are fighters to pursue enemy aircraft beyond visual range of the strike force. Our primary mission is protection. Thatch noticed several newer pilots nodding obediently, their faces displaying the appropriate seriousness. But he also caught knowing glances between veteran pilots who understood that combat rarely conformed to prepared plans. After the briefing, as pilots dispersed to their aircraft, Phillips pulled Thatch aside. "James, I need your squadron covering the high sector today. Your pilots have the most experience." Thatch nodded. "We'll keep them off the bombers, Sam." Phillips lowered his voice. "Intelligence says they're going to throw everything at us. Admiral's concerned about being outnumbered." "Numbers aren't everything," Thatch replied. "We've got better planes, better training." Phillips looked unconvinced. "Just stick to doctrine. No heroics." Thatch forced a smile but said nothing. By 0700 hours, Thatch's squadron was airborne, climbing to 20,000 feet above the task force. The carrier decks below shrunk to toy-like proportions as they ascended. The massive fleet spread across miles of ocean. Lieutenant Harvey Ross, Thatch's wingman, pulled alongside. "Beautiful day for a turkey shoot, Commander," he called over the radio. "Stay focused, Harv. Don't get cocky," Thatch responded, though he privately agreed with the assessment. The Hellcat had proven itself devastating against Japanese aircraft in previous engagements. For nearly 2 hours, they patrolled without incident. The sun climbed higher, and the cockpit grew uncomfortably warm despite the high altitude. Some pilots grew restless, making small talk over the radio until the squadron communications officer ordered radio discipline. Then, at 9:17, the radar picket destroyers stationed 50 miles ahead of the fleet reported contacts, many contacts, inbound from the west. "Bandits bearing 270, Angels 15, multiple groups," came the urgent call from the fighter director aboard Lexington. "All cap aircraft vector to intercept." Thatch banked his squadron toward the reported bearing, pushing his throttle forward. "Heads up, people. Remember your training. Elements of 2. Maintain visual contact with your wingman at all times," he instructed, his voice calm despite the adrenaline now coursing through his system. They climbed another 5,000 feet, positioning for a height advantage. Minutes later, they saw them, dark specks against the blue sky, gradually resolving into recognizable shapes. "My God," breathed Ross over the radio, momentarily forgetting protocol. "There must be 100 of them." Thatch's more experienced eyes made a quick assessment. "More like 200, he corrected. "Looks like strike packages with fighter escort. Zeros up top, bombers below." The radio crackled with the voice of the fighter director. "All fighters engage enemy aircraft. Priority on defending the task force. Do not pursue beyond 50 miles from fleet center." As they closed distance, Thatch could now clearly make out the distinctive silhouettes of the A6M Zeros. at least 60 of them, escorting a larger formation of torpedo and dive bombers. His mind raced through options, considering and discarding standard approaches. The Japanese had numbers, but they were committed to protecting their strike force. Their tactics would be predictable. Standard doctrine called for American fighters to engage the escort fighters first, drawing them away from the bombers, which could then be attacked by a second wave of interceptors. But Thatch saw an opportunity. VF2, this is Thatch. Modified plan. Blue section, take high cover. Red section with me. We're going to hit them head-on, then split and dive through the bomber formation. The fighter director's voice immediately cut in. Negative, Daredevil. Maintain standard intercept procedure. You are outnumbered. Thatch hesitated only briefly. Temporary radio malfunction, he responded, then switched to the squadron tactical frequency. Red section on my mark. We execute a high-speed pass through their fighter screen, then immediate split S and maximum power dive through the bomber formation. They won't be able to follow. Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Felton, a replacement pilot with only 2 combat missions under his belt, voiced the concern others might be feeling. Commander, the Zeros can turn inside us if we miss on the first pass. We won't, Thatch interrupted. And they can't follow us in a power dive. That's our advantage. What Thatch didn't say explicitly was that the maneuver he planned would take the Hellcats well beyond their official performance envelope. His private testing had convinced him the airframe could handle it, but he was betting 8 pilots' lives on his unsanctioned experiments. As the 2 formations closed at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour, Thatch watched the distance rapidly diminish. Japanese pilots, spotting the approaching Americans, began breaking formation to meet the threat. Steady! Steady! Thatch called, leading his section directly toward the enemy fighter screen. Now! At 800 yards, still well beyond effective firing range, Thatch's section opened fire. The psychological effect was immediate. The Japanese formation wavered as pilots instinctively reacted to the tracers streaking toward them. In that moment of disruption, Thatch's fighters tore through the screen, each selecting targets of opportunity for brief firing passes. Split now. Full power dive, Thatch commanded, rolling his Hellcat inverted, then pulling the stick back to his stomach. The negative G-force sent blood rushing to his head as the horizon spun, the blue Pacific replacing the blue sky in his canopy. His Hellcat responded instantly, pitching downward at an angle approaching 70 degrees. The airspeed indicator wound rapidly past 300 knots, then 350, the maximum recommended diving speed. But Thatch didn't level off. Instead, he pushed the stick slightly forward, increasing the dive angle. 400 knots, 450. The airframe began to shudder. Warning lights illuminated on his instrument panel. Behind him, his squadron followed, their Hellcats plummeting toward the vulnerable bomber formation thousands of feet below. The Japanese Zero pilots, caught by surprise, attempted to follow, but quickly discovered a fatal limitation of their aircraft. As they pushed over into steep dives, their controls began to stiffen alarmingly. The Zero's lightweight design, so advantageous in turning fights, became a liability in high-speed dives. As their airspeed built beyond 300 knots, the control surfaces became virtually immovable, preventing the sharp pull-out that would be necessary to follow the Americans. Some more experienced Japanese pilots, recognizing the danger, abandoned the pursuit. Others, driven by determination or inexperience, pressed the dive beyond their aircraft's capabilities. The results were catastrophic. 3 Zeros broke apart mid-air, their wing structures failing under loads they were never designed to withstand. Others managed to pull out, but far too late to prevent the Americans from reaching the bomber formation. Thatch's Hellcat was now hurtling downward at nearly 500 knots, the airframe vibrating violently. The control stick felt like it was embedded in concrete, requiring all his strength to move it even slightly. His ears popped painfully from the rapid pressure changes. The altimeter unwound with dizzying speed. Warning indicators screamed for attention. Airspeed exceeding limits. G-forces approaching structural maximums. But Thatch had experienced this before in his testing, knew exactly how much farther he could push the envelope. "Hold the dive," he called to his squadron, knowing they must be experiencing the same warnings. "Pull out at 15,000 feet, Not before. The bomber formation grew rapidly in his windscreen, the Japanese pilots unaware of the threat plummeting toward them until it was too late. At exactly 15,000 feet, Thatch heaved back on the stick with both hands. The G-forces crushed him into his seat as the Hellcat's nose slowly, agonizingly, began to rise. 5 Gs, 6 Gs, 7 Gs. His vision narrowed to a pinpoint, then began to grey out. Using techniques practiced countless times, he tensed his abdominal muscles and executed a controlled breathing maneuver to maintain consciousness. The Hellcat's structure groaned under stresses approaching its design limits, but it held. As his flight path leveled, Thatch found himself in the middle of the Japanese bomber formation, traveling over 100 knots faster than the shocked enemy pilots. It was like a wolf suddenly materializing among a flock of sheep. His first burst caught a Kate torpedo bomber directly in front of him, its fuel tanks erupting in a fireball he had to swerve violently to avoid. Banking hard right, he lined up a Val dive bomber and sent it spiraling toward the ocean with a 3-second burst to its engine. All around him, his pilots were reaping the benefits of their unconventional attack. The Japanese formation disintegrated into chaos. Thatch, this is Lexington combat. Return to standard altitude immediately. Repeat, abort dive attack. The fighter director's voice held a note of panic. Thatch ignored the command, knowing that events had already moved beyond the possibility of recall. In the next 4 minutes, his 8 Hellcats destroyed 27 Japanese aircraft, an astounding ratio that would have been impossible using conventional tactics. And as they pulled away from the shattered Japanese formation, climbing back to a defensive position, they observed something unexpected. The remaining Zeros attempting to dive after them were encountering the same structural limitations that had claimed their comrades. Several more disintegrated in mid-air, unable to pull out of dives their airframes couldn't survive. Word of Thatch's successful tactic spread quickly across the radio net. Other Hellcat squadrons engaging additional waves of Japanese attackers began employing the same high-speed diving attacks with similar results. By mid-afternoon, the skies above the American fleet had become a graveyard of Japanese aircraft, and James Thatch knew he had just changed aerial warfare forever, through an act of calculated disobedience that would either end his career or rewrite the tactical manual. The battle that would later become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot reached its climactic phase by mid-afternoon on June 19, 1944. What had begun as Lieutenant Commander Thatch's desperate improvisation had cascaded into a revolution in air combat tactics. As reports flooded into the combat information centers aboard the American carriers, a clear pattern emerged. Hellcat squadrons employing Thatch's high-speed diving attacks were achieving kill ratios that defied belief. By 1400 hours, Admiral Mitscher had temporarily suspended the order prohibiting such tactics, acknowledging the undeniable results. Aboard the USS Lexington, Thatch landed to refuel and rearm, his Hellcat showing visible signs of stress from the extreme maneuvers he'd subjected it to. As ground crews swarmed the aircraft, he noticed stress fractures along several wing panels, evidence of how close to structural failure he had come. The squadron maintenance chief approached, clipboard in hand, his expression darkening as he examined the aircraft. "Commander, this bird exceeded maximum G-loading by at least 30%. Look at these panel separations." Thatch nodded, removing his helmet. "She held together, Chief. That's what matters." "This time," the chief responded grimly. "I can patch her for one more sortie, but she'll need a complete structural inspection after that." As Thatch walked toward the ready room for debriefing, he was intercepted by Commander Phillips, the air group commander. Phillips's expression was unreadable as he led Thatch to a private corner of the flight deck. 67 confirmed kills for your squadron alone, James. 27 on your first engagement." He shook his head in disbelief. "That's more than most squadrons get in an entire deployment." Thatch waited for the reprimand he knew must be coming. "You violated direct orders, exceeded aircraft operational limitations, and risked 8 perfectly good Hellcats and their pilots." Phillips's voice was matter-of-fact, without anger. "Yes, sir. The CAG from Enterprise reports similar results using your tactic. So does Yorktown." Phillips stared out at the ocean for a moment. Admiral Mitchell wants a full briefing on this diving attack technique. Tomorrow, 0800. Thatch blinked in surprise. The Admiral, sir? This isn't just about today, is it, James? You've been testing these maneuvers for months. It wasn't a question. Thatch considered his response carefully. The performance data in the manual is conservative, sir. I discovered the Hellcat could sustain much higher diving speeds than documented. The Zero can't match it. Their controls lock up completely above 350 knots. And you didn't report these findings through proper channels because... I did, sir, 3 separate reports, all classified as interesting but requiring further study. Phillips nodded slowly. Well, I'd say today counts as further study. He handed Thatch a clipboard. I need everything you know about these high-speed diving tactics documented before you meet with the Admiral, maximum speeds, optimal dive angles, pull-out altitudes, the works. Yes, sir? And James? Phillips's stern expression softened slightly. Good work today. As Thatch made his way to the ready room, news of subsequent engagements continued to pour in. Japanese attack formations, approaching in waves throughout the afternoon, met the same fate as the first. American Hellcat pilots, now deliberately seeking out the high-altitude advantage that enabled the diving attacks, systematically dismantled the Japanese air groups. The most dramatic engagement occurred at 15:30 hours, when Commander David McCampbell's air group from USS Essex encountered a formation of over 70 aircraft from the Japanese carrier Zuikaku. Employing Thatch's diving technique, McCampbell's 16 Hellcats destroyed 42 enemy aircraft without a single American loss. Lieutenant Junior Grade Philip Kirkwood, a pilot from VF-15 who had witnessed McCampbell's attack, described the scene during debriefing. The Zeros tried to turn inside us at first, their standard tactic. When we didn't engage but climbed above them instead, they seemed confused. Once we began our dives, a few tried to follow us down. That's when we saw them breaking apart. 4 of them just disintegrated, wings separating from fuselages. By sunset, American combat air patrols had decimated the Japanese aerial armada. Official after-action reports would place Japanese losses at over 300 aircraft, nearly 70% of their committed forces. American losses totaled just 23 aircraft, many of those due to operational accidents rather than enemy action. In the CIC aboard Lexington, intelligence officers struggled to process the lopsided statistics. These numbers can't be right, one lieutenant insisted, reviewing the preliminary tally. Check with the other carriers again. But subsequent verifications only confirmed the extraordinary outcome. That evening, as flight operations ceased, Thatch sat alone in his quarters, meticulously documenting everything he had learned about the Hellcat's performance characteristics. His notebook contained months of observations, calculations, and theories, many directly contradicting the official limitations specified by both the manufacturer and the Navy. On a fresh page, he began drafting what would become known as the Thatch Dive Attack Protocol. He detailed optimal entry altitudes, speed parameters, dive angles, and most importantly, the critical structural warnings pilots needed to observe. Maximum sustainable dive speed, 510 knots indicated airspeed, he wrote. Caution, above 470 knots, control forces increase exponentially. Pilot strength becomes the limiting factor for pull-out capability. He included diagrams showing the ideal attack profile, a 70-degree initial dive angle, shallowing to 50 degrees during the attack phase, with pull-out initiated at least 15,000 feet above sea level to allow sufficient altitude for recovery. As he wrote, Thatch reflected on the Hellcat's remarkable structural integrity. Grumman engineers had built tremendous strength into the airframe, far more than the official specifications acknowledged. This over-engineering, combined with the powerful Pratt & Whitney engine, created an aircraft with capabilities beyond what even its creators had envisioned. Across the fleet that night, other pilots were making similar discoveries, comparing notes about their aircraft's previously unknown performance envelope. The revolution in aerial combat tactics had begun, sparked by one man's willingness to challenge established doctrine. Before retiring, Thatch made one final note in his journal. What defeated the Japanese today wasn't superior numbers or even superior aircraft. It was the willingness to question assumptions and test boundaries. The enemy counted on us following our own rulebook. The moment we stepped outside it, their defense fell apart. The next morning, as Thatch prepared to brief Admiral Mach, reports arrived of the Japanese fleet's retreat. The decisive American victory in the air had translated directly to command of the sea. With their air cover decimated, Japanese carriers were forced to withdraw, unable to launch effective strikes or defend themselves. Operation Ago, the Imperial Japanese Navy's ambitious counter-offensive, had ended in catastrophic failure. And at the center of this historic victory stood the unassuming figure of James Thatch, a man whose career might have ended for insubordination just 24 hours earlier, now preparing to reshape naval aviation doctrine through his unauthorized discovery. In the immediate aftermath of what would be officially named the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Commander James Thatch found himself in an unprecedented position. Rather than facing disciplinary action for violating direct orders and aircraft operational guidelines, he was summoned to a series of high-level briefings with Admiral Mach and his staff. The first such meeting, held in Mach's flag quarters aboard the USS Lexington on June 21st, set the tone for what would follow. "Explain to me exactly what you discovered about the Hellcats' diving capabilities," Mach demanded without preamble, his weathered face showing neither approval nor censure. For the next 2 hours, Thatch methodically presented his findings, supported by combat data gathered during the previous day's engagement. Admiral Mach, himself a naval aviator of considerable experience, asked penetrating questions that revealed his grasp of the technical issues involved. When Thatch concluded his presentation, the Admiral remained silent for nearly a minute, studying the performance charts. "You realize, Commander, that you violated multiple standing orders," he finally said. "Yes, sir. And that your actions could have resulted in catastrophic aircraft failures and loss of pilots." "I was confident in my testing, Admiral. The structural margins—" Mach held up a hand, silencing him. 300 enemy aircraft destroyed, 23 of ours lost." He removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I'd say the results speak for themselves." Within 48 hours, Mach had authorized a fleet-wide tactical bulletin incorporating Thatch's diving attack technique, now officially designated the High-Speed Vertical Attack Protocol. Engineering teams were dispatched to each carrier to inspect Hellcats that had performed the maneuver, gathering critical data on structural stress points. By June 25th, as Task Force 58 continued operations in support of the Mariana Islands invasion, modified maintenance procedures were implemented to accommodate the new tactics. Pilots across the fleet received updated training on the technique, with Thatch temporarily reassigned to develop a formal instruction program. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to comprehend the sudden shift in combat dynamics. Intercepted radio transmissions, later decoded by American intelligence, revealed their confusion. American aircraft employing new diving attacks impossible to counter. Pilots report controls non-responsive when attempting to pursue. A subsequent message from Vice Admiral Ozawa to Imperial Headquarters acknowledged the devastating implications. "Enemy fighters have discovered tactical advantage our aircraft cannot match. Recommend accelerated deployment of improved fighter types with strengthened airframes." But the Japanese naval aviation arm had suffered losses it could not replace, not just in aircraft, which their diminishing industrial capacity could still produce, but in experienced pilots, who represented years of intensive training. More than 200 Japanese aviators perished during the battle, many of them veterans with irreplaceable experience. For James Thatch, personal vindication came in the form of a Navy Cross, presented by Admiral Nimitz himself during a ceremony in August 1944. The citation made no mention of disobeying orders, instead praising his exceptional tactical innovation leading to outstanding combat success. But the true measure of his impact came in September, when the Bureau of Aeronautics issued revised performance specifications for the F-6F Hellcat, officially acknowledging the enhanced diving capabilities Thatch had discovered. The new manual included a section titled Vertical Attack Tactics, which incorporated his findings almost verbatim. Following the Philippine Sea engagement, Thatch received numerous letters from pilots across the fleet who had employed his tactics in subsequent battles. One such letter, from Lieutenant William Mason of VF-18, captured the sentiment of many. "Your diving attack saved my life and those of my squadron mates during the Leyte operations. The Japanese expected us to turn with them, a fight we couldn't win. Instead, we used your technique, diving through their formations at speeds they couldn't match. 26 kills, no losses. Thank you, Commander." As 1944 drew to a close, Thatch was reassigned to Naval Air Station Patuxent River as a test pilot and tactical instructor, where he continued refining high-speed combat maneuvers. There he worked with engineers to develop the next generation of naval fighters, aircraft that would build on the lessons learned from the Hellcats' unexpected capabilities. He maintained detailed correspondence with frontline squadrons, continuously gathering data on the evolving air war in the Pacific. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, tactical innovations pioneered by Thatch and others had helped establish complete American air superiority. The final statistics told the story. Japanese naval aviation, which had begun the war with some of the world's finest pilots and aircraft, had been systematically destroyed. Of the approximately 1,500 carrier-qualified pilots Japan possessed at the war's start, fewer than 200 remained by war's end. More than 3,000 Japanese naval aircraft had been shot down, with American Hellcats accounting for nearly half of those victories. After the war, Thatch continued his naval career, eventually rising to the rank of admiral before retiring in 1967. Throughout those years, he maintained the same questioning attitude that had led to his breakthrough in 1944. During the Korean War, he helped develop jet combat tactics, once again challenging conventional wisdom about aircraft capabilities. Later, as commander of Carrier Division 3 during the early Vietnam conflict, he emphasized the importance of tactical innovation to a new generation of naval aviators. In 1973, nearly 3 decades after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Thatch was interviewed for a Naval Institute oral history project. Asked about his most significant contribution to naval aviation, he responded with characteristic modesty. "I just noticed something the engineers had built into the Hellcat that wasn't in the manual. The real credit belongs to the Grumman workers who overbuilt those airframes. They gave us aircraft that could do more than anyone thought possible." The interviewer pressed further, "But you were the one who discovered this capability and had the courage to implement it in combat, despite orders to the contrary." Thatch was silent for a moment before responding. "In combat, sometimes you have to trust your training and experience over what's written in a manual. The Japanese expected us to fight according to established doctrine. The moment we stepped outside that box, we gained an advantage they couldn't counter." He paused, then added, "That's the lesson I hope remains. Never stop questioning, never stop testing assumptions. The moment you think you know all the answers is the moment you become vulnerable." Throughout his life, Thatch maintained contact with many of the pilots who had flown with him that pivotal day in June 1944. At reunions and veteran gatherings, they often reminisced about the dive that changed the war. Lieutenant Harvey Ross, who had followed Thatch in the first experimental attack, later became a commercial airline pilot. In 1968, at a gathering of former VF-2 pilots, Ross proposed a toast to Commander Thatch, who taught us that sometimes the best way to follow the rules is to know exactly when to break them. The tactics Thatch pioneered continued to influence naval aviation long after propeller-driven fighters gave way to jets. The concept of exploiting unique performance characteristics, rather than engaging on the enemy's terms, became a cornerstone of American fighter doctrine. At Top Gun, the Navy's elite fighter weapons school established in 1969, instructors still referenced the Thatch dive when teaching the principles of energy management in air combat. Perhaps the greatest testament to Thatch's legacy came from an unexpected source. In 1983, a former Japanese naval aviator named Saburo Sakai, who had survived the Pacific War to become one of Japan's most respected veterans, visited the United States. During a symposium at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, he was asked about the turning point in the air war. "It was not just your better aircraft or greater numbers," he replied through an interpreter. It was the moment your pilot stopped fighting, according to the predictable patterns we had trained against. When your Hellcats began using those diving attacks, we had no answer. They discovered a weakness in our aircraft that we ourselves had not fully recognized. As we reflect on the remarkable story of James Thatch and the high-speed diving tactic that changed the course of the Pacific Air War, several profound lessons emerge that transcend the specific historical moment. First and foremost stands the power of questioning established wisdom. The official performance manuals, written conservatively to protect lives and equipment, created an artificial ceiling on what the Hellcat could actually accomplish. Thatch's willingness to systematically test these boundaries, not recklessly but through careful, incremental experimentation, revealed capabilities that proved decisive in combat. This tension between institutional caution and frontline innovation repeats throughout military history. How many other technologies and tactics have hidden capabilities waiting to be discovered by those willing to ask, is this really the limit? The mathematical implications of Thatch's discovery were staggering. Prior to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American planners calculated fighter-to-fighter exchanges based on relatively even loss ratios. The introduction of the high-speed diving attack changed this equation dramatically, creating scenarios where a single American squadron could engage superior numbers with minimal losses. This shift in combat mathematics rippled throughout the Pacific campaign, allowing American commanders to plan more aggressive operations with greater confidence in air superiority. The psychological impact on both sides proved equally significant. For American pilots, the discovery transformed their approach to combat, replacing defensive caution with aggressive confidence. Knowing they possessed a decisive tactical advantage that the enemy couldn't counter, they engaged Japanese formations more boldly, further increasing their effectiveness. For Japanese aviators, the psychological effect worked in reverse. The sudden appearance of an unstoppable American tactic created a sense of inevitable defeat. Pilots who had once relied on the Zero's superior maneuverability now found themselves without a countering strategy, leading to hesitation and uncertainty in combat, factors that proved as deadly as the American guns themselves. Perhaps most poignant is the human story at the center of this technological and tactical revolution. Thatch wasn't a rebellious maverick who disregarded rules for personal glory. Rather, he was a thoughtful, methodical officer who recognized when established doctrine had fallen out of alignment with battlefield realities. His calculated risk, knowing it might end his career, came from the deeper understanding that the lives of his fellow aviators and the success of the American cause outweighed personal consequences. What shocked me most about researching this story was discovering how close the American Navy came to never implementing this revolutionary tactic. Had Thatch followed orders that fateful day, had he adhered strictly to the performance limitations specified in the manual, the battle might have unfolded very differently. The Japanese might have inflicted much heavier losses on the American fleet, potentially altering the timeline of the Pacific War. This raises a profound question about military innovation. How many potential breakthroughs remain undiscovered because those who see the possibilities lack the authority or courage to implement them? Modern militaries struggle with this same tension: how to maintain necessary discipline and standardization while creating space for the innovative thinking that produces decisive advantages. The legacy of James Thatch's discovery extends far beyond the specific tactic he pioneered. It stands as a testament to the value of intellectual curiosity, calculated risk-taking, and the courage to challenge established wisdom when evidence suggests better approaches exist. In today's rapidly evolving battlefield environments, with technologies advancing at unprecedented rates, these qualities remain as vital as they were in the skies above the Philippine Sea in 1944. What other assumptions are we operating under today that might be proven wrong by someone willing to question and test them? What capabilities might exist in our current systems that remain undiscovered because we accept the limitations described in manuals and doctrine? These questions should challenge military thinkers, engineers, and frontline operators alike. As we consider the extraordinary kill ratio achieved during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, over 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed for minimal American losses, we must recognize that this outcome wasn't inevitable. It resulted from the convergence of superior technology, tactical innovation, and one man's willingness to trust his judgment over established doctrine at a pivotal moment. The study of such turning points reminds us that warfare is not merely a contest of numbers and equipment, but of ideas, adaptation, and the courage to implement new approaches when circumstances demand. What shocked you most about this story of innovation, disobedience, and battlefield transformation? Was it the dramatic kill ratio achieved through a single tactical innovation? The fact that the Hellcats' true capabilities remained undiscovered until combat necessity forced exploration? Or perhaps the realization that victory often hinges not on who has the better equipment, but on who better understands how to use what they have? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this account of James Thatch's revolutionary discovery enlightening, please share it with others interested in the hidden stories that shaped World War II's outcome. History reminds us that the most significant advantages often come not from following the rulebook, but from knowing precisely when and how to write a new one.